where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
You've been told your entire life that visibility is earned through beauty, charm, and performing the right social scripts. But what if that's the exact lie keeping you invisible? Here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to say out loud. Some of us were raised to be supporting characters in everyone else's story, trained from childhood to accept the scraps of attention while others feast on adoration. You know exactly what I'm talking about if you've ever watched your sister, your friend, your colleague receive the praise, the proposals, the priority, while you stood in the same room wondering what mysterious code they possessed that you somehow lacked. Society's conspiracy is devastatingly simple. Convince certain women they're inherently less desirable, less interesting, less worthy, and they'll police themselves so effectively you won't even need to exclude them. They'll exclude themselves. But here's where it gets interesting, where the secret reveals itself. The most desired people aren't the ones performing the hardest. They're not contorting themselves to fit impossible standards or exhausting themselves trying to be universally appealing. They've cracked a code that sounds almost too simple to be true. They've stopped trying to attract everyone and started being undeniably themselves, trusting that the right people will cross ballrooms to reach them. This isn't about becoming someone else or acquiring some mysterious quality you lack. It's about recognizing that you've been standing in the wrong room, evaluated by the wrong criteria, hoping for validation from people who were never going to see you because they weren't looking for what you offer. The revelation that changes everything is this: you're not the problem. You never were. In the next few minutes, I'm going to share something that took me 15 years of invisibility to understand. A complete restructuring of how attraction, value, and identity actually work when you stop accepting the narratives that were designed to keep you small. This isn't theory. This is lived experience, the hard-won knowledge from someone who was the forgotten sister, the overlooked daughter, the woman men asked about only to get introductions to someone more interesting. Until one evening, everything shifted. Not because I became prettier or more charming, but because I finally stopped participating in my own erasure. And what happened next proved that the most powerful form of attraction isn't performance. It's presence, the quiet confidence of someone who's stopped apologizing for taking up space. She'd been the forgotten daughter for 15 winters, standing in shadows while her sisters danced under chandeliers that seemed to shine only for them. The ballrooms knew her name, yet nobody truly saw her face. Every duke, every earl, every gentleman caller would arrive at their estate asking for Elizabeth or Catherine, never for her. It wasn't that she lacked beauty or grace. No, the enigma ran deeper than surface judgments. Her family had carved out roles long before she could protest, assigning her the part of the serious one, while her sisters claimed the charming ones. The vestiges of childhood comparisons had built invisible walls around her, brick by brick, until she'd become a ghost in her own story. Society's conspiracy was simple. Some flowers were meant for display, others for pressing quietly between book pages. The silence surrounding her existence spoke louder than any scandalous whisper ever could. She'd learned early that certain daughters received new gowns for every season, while others inherited last year's hemmed-down dresses with apologetic smiles. Her mother would spend hours preparing her sisters for balls, curling hair, selecting jewels, debating which fan matched which dress. But when she'd appear ready, there'd be a quick glance and a pat on the shoulder. "You look perfectly adequate, dear. You've always been so wonderfully low maintenance." The words landed like compliments but felt like dismissals, a code her heart deciphered instantly. She wasn't low maintenance, she was low priority. There's a particular ache that comes from watching your mother's eyes light up for everyone but you. A disappearance of maternal devotion that leaves scars no one else can see. Think of a rose garden where the gardener tends obsessively to the red and pink blooms, giving them the best soil, the most sunlight, the sweetest water. Meanwhile, there's a white rose in the corner, equally beautiful, equally fragrant, but it grows in partial shade because nobody thought to position it better. That rose doesn't die. Roses are resilient creatures. But it grows differently, stretching desperately toward whatever light it can find, developing a shape that's all wrong, contorted by neglect rather than flourishing in abundance. She'd become that white rose, twisting herself into uncomfortable shapes just to catch a sliver of attention. The conflict wasn't between her and her sisters. They'd never chosen this hierarchy. The real battle was internal, fighting against the voice that whispered she simply wasn't worth the effort everyone lavished on others. Her identity formed not from who she was, but from who she wasn't. "I'm not as witty as Elizabeth," she'd think, while sitting silent at dinner parties. "I'm not as musical as Catherine," she'd remind herself when gentlemen gathered around the pianoforte. Every self-definition started with negation, with absence, with lack. She'd become fluent in the language of self-diminishment, speaking it so naturally that nobody questioned the forbidden truth underneath, that she'd never been given permission to discover who she actually was. When your entire childhood consists of comparisons, you don't develop an authentic self. You develop a reactive self, existing only in relation to others. It's like learning to read by only studying what letters aren't, rather than what they are. You end up literate in absence, but illiterate in presence. The mysterious thing about invisibility is that eventually, you become its most dedicated accomplice. Her family didn't need to exclude her anymore. She excluded herself preemptively, saving everyone the trouble. She'd volunteer to stay home from events because someone should keep grandmother company. She'd insist her sisters take the best seats in the carriage because they'd appreciate the view more. She'd redirect conversations away from herself because surely everyone would rather hear about Elizabeth's suitors. This wasn't nobility or selflessness. This was survival. If you make yourself small enough, you can't be disappointed when others treat you as small. The secret she carried was that she'd stopped waiting for someone to see her because she'd become terrified of what they might find if they actually looked. Society reinforced everything her family had established, creating a conspiracy of indifference that felt almost coordinated. At balls, gentlemen would bow politely, ask after her sisters, then drift away like she'd been a mere stepping stone to more interesting destinations. Matrons would smile vaguely in her direction before focusing their matchmaking energies on her more promising siblings. Even servants seemed to sense the hierarchy, always attending to her sister's needs first, treating her requests as afterthoughts. She'd internalized every slight until she couldn't distinguish between others' perceptions and her own self-worth. The vestige of her true self had faded so completely that she'd started believing the lie. Some women were born to be chosen, others to be overlooked. She'd accepted her role in this unspoken arrangement. The truly devastating revelation came when she realized she'd begun policing herself more harshly than anyone else ever had. Her mother's voice had taken residence in her mind, critiquing every choice before she made it. "Don't laugh too loudly. You'll seem unrefined." "Don't share that opinion. You'll seem difficult." "Don't hope for too much. You'll seem desperate." She'd constructed an elaborate prison of hidden rules, each one designed to keep her safely small, safely forgettable. safely protected from the pain of reaching for something and having it denied. The enigma wasn't why others overlooked her. It was why she'd become so skilled at overlooking herself, at treating her own desires as inconvenient disruptions to everyone else's comfort. Yet something whispered beneath all that learned invisibility, a persistent revelation trying to break through. Late at night, when the house fell silent and she could finally stop performing her role, she'd feel it. A restless stirring, a suggestion that perhaps this wasn't the only story available to her. Perhaps the life she'd been living was merely prologue, the quiet chapters that made the transformation meaningful when it finally arrived. She didn't know yet that invisibility could be unlearned, that years of conditioning could be questioned, that the most disappeared parts of herself might actually be the most valuable. All she knew was that something had to shift, because living as a shadow was slowly killing the substance underneath. Sunday gatherings at the estate followed a ritual so predictable she could have scripted every conversation before they happened. The entire family would assemble: aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, and the interrogation would begin, but never for her. Elizabeth would be questioned about her latest suitor, every detail dissected with delighted curiosity. Catherine would be asked about her upcoming performance at Lady Rothbury's musicale, everyone eager to hear about her preparations. But when eyes drifted toward her, silence, or worse, the perfunctory, "And how are your studies coming along, dear?" As if intellectual pursuits were consolation prizes for those who'd failed at being interesting. The secret nobody acknowledged was that her family had decided long ago who deserved the spotlight, and she simply wasn't cast in that role. Their questions revealed their priorities, and she'd learned to read the code perfectly. Her life wasn't curiosity-worthy. One Sunday, she conducted an experiment, a quiet rebellion nobody would even notice. She remained completely silent throughout the entire afternoon, didn't offer observations, didn't answer questions nobody asked, didn't fill the conversational gaps she usually filled out of habit. She sat there, present but deliberately withdrawn, testing whether anyone would register her absence from the dialogue. 3 hours passed. Dessert was served and cleared. Her father told his hunting stories. Her mother discussed the upcoming season. Her sisters laughed and gossiped. Not a single person inquired if she was well, if something troubled her, if she had anything to contribute. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Her family had grown so accustomed to her invisibility that they couldn't detect when she amplified it. She disappeared from the conversation, and nobody noticed she'd gone. Every family operates on an unspoken hierarchy, a mysterious system that nobody discusses but everyone understands. There's the golden child, the one whose accomplishments get announced at parties, whose portrait gets the place of honor, whose happiness becomes everyone's priority. There's the reliable one, the daughter who'll care for aging parents, who'll sacrifice her own prospects for family harmony, who'll always be available because nobody expects her to have other plans. There's even the difficult one. At least she generates attention, even if it's exasperation. Then there's the forgotten one, existing in a strange limbo where she's neither celebrated nor mourned, neither praised nor criticized, simply overlooked. She'd inhabited that category so long she'd started believing it was her natural habitat, a hidden truth about her fundamental unworthiness that everyone could sense except her. The signs had always been there, written in invisible ink that only became legible once she knew to look for them. Her family contacted her exclusively when they needed something. "You're so good with accounts. Could you help sort through Father's ledgers?" Or, "You're always so patient. Would you mind tutoring your cousin?" Her accomplishments vanished into silence while her sister's minor achievements generated celebrations. When Elizabeth received a marriage proposal from a baron, the household erupted in jubilation for weeks. When she'd had her watercolors accepted into a prestigious exhibition, her mother said, "How lovely, dear," and immediately changed the subject to Catherine's new dress. The conspiracy wasn't malicious. It was worse. It was unconscious. A reflexive devaluation so ingrained, nobody even recognized they were doing it. She'd become the family's emotional labor, expected to facilitate everyone else's happiness, while her own remained perpetually postponed. Nobody knew the details of her interior life because nobody had ever asked. Her family couldn't name her closest friend, her favorite novel, her secret ambitions, the things that made her laugh until tears came. They'd assigned her a character, the quiet, bookish one, and never bothered investigating whether actual complexity existed beneath that convenient label. She'd become a function rather than a person, valued for what she provided rather than who she was. When conflicts arose, they'd summon her to mediate, trusting her reasonableness, her lack of drama. But when joy was distributed, she'd watch from the margins, the perpetual witness to everyone else's happiness. The silence surrounding her personhood had grown so complete that she'd started wondering if she'd imagined having an inner life at all. She'd been 25 when she finally confronted the enigma directly, voice shaking but determined. Her mother was gushing about Elizabeth's third proposal that season, analyzing which suitor offered the best prospects, and something inside her fractured. "Mother?" she'd interrupted, her words cutting through the excited chatter like a blade through silk. "Have you ever once asked about my romantic prospects? Whether I'm courting anyone? Whether I want to be courted?" The room froze, every face turning toward her with identical expressions of shocked confusion, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. Her mother's response came wrapped in wounded innocence. "Darling, you never share anything. You're so terribly private. How could I possibly know what's happening in your life?" The conflict crystallized in that moment. Her family had reframed their neglect as her failure to communicate, shifting responsibility back onto her shoulders where it had always rested. The forbidden truth was simpler and more painful. They hadn't asked because they hadn't cared enough to ask. Asking required curiosity, and curiosity required valuing someone's inner world enough to explore it. She'd spent years making herself available, hoping proximity would eventually translate to priority, believing that if she just served faithfully enough, someone would finally see her. But availability breeds contempt, or worse, it breeds indifference. Her family had learned they could take her for granted because she'd never demanded otherwise. She'd trained them to overlook her by accepting every slight with grace, every dismissal with understanding, every inequality with martyred silence. The vestige of resentment she'd suppressed for decades had calcified into something harder, something that whispered a dangerous possibility. Perhaps the problem wasn't her inadequacy, but their inability to recognize what stood right before them. Yet even recognizing the pattern didn't immediately break it, because family systems resist change with impressive force. The roles they'd assigned carried invisible contracts. She'd provide stability. They'd provide what exactly? The vague promise of belonging, of being part of something even if that something relegated her to the margins. The hidden agreement had been signed in childhood, renewed through years of compliance, and breaking it would require more than confrontation. It would require the most terrifying act imaginable. Deciding she was worth more than the scraps of attention they occasionally threw her way. Believing she deserved a life where she wasn't constantly auditioning for basic consideration. The revelation that would change everything was still forming, still gathering strength, but it whispered persistently, "Family should see you, and if they don't, perhaps it's time to find those who will." She'd spent 3 months preparing a presentation for her father's business associates, pouring every ounce of skill into charts and projections that would demonstrate her strategic thinking. The evening arrived, candles illuminating the study, where distinguished gentlemen gathered to hear proposals for expanding the family's shipping investments. She presented with clarity and precision, her data impeccable, her arguments sound. When she finished, polite applause rippled through the room, and her father's business partner offered his assessment. "Very thorough, my dear, though perhaps with a bit more enthusiasm? You want to make them feel the opportunity, not just understand it." Meanwhile, her cousin Thomas, who'd stumbled through a half-formed proposal about textile imports, received hearty congratulations for his natural business instincts and commanding presence. The secret she'd been avoiding crashed into consciousness. She could be twice as competent and still be perceived as half as valuable because she was performing excellence in the wrong costume. The truly devastating part wasn't their dismissal, it was her response to it. She went home and practiced enthusiasm in her mirror, trying to manufacture the effortless charisma that seemed to flow naturally from others. She studied how Elizabeth captivated rooms, how Catherine commanded attention, attempting to reverse-engineer their mysterious alchemy and apply it to herself. The conspiracy she'd fallen into was believing that if she just worked harder, presented better, became more like them, eventually she'd earn the recognition she craved. But that's like trying to fit into a gown designed for someone else's body. You can cinch and pin and adjust all you want, but it will never hang quite right, because it wasn't cut for your shape. She was tailoring herself to specifications that had nothing to do with who she actually was, chasing an approval that moved further away the harder she pursued it. Think of someone handing you shoes 2 sizes too small and insisting, "These are the only acceptable footwear for the ball." You have 2 choices. You can squeeze your feet in, accepting the pain as the price of participation, limping through the evening with a smile plastered over your agony. Or you can acknowledge that these shoes weren't made for you and find ones that actually fit, even if it means walking a different path than everyone else. Most of us spend our entire lives with bleeding feet, convinced that the problem is our feet rather than the shoes. We starve ourselves, reshape ourselves, diminish ourselves, all trying to fit into expectations that were never designed with us in mind. Meanwhile, there are people dancing comfortably in shoes that fit perfectly, and we assume they're just naturally better at walking, when really they're just wearing the right size. She'd developed patterns so automatic, she didn't even recognize them as choices anymore. When entering a room, she'd immediately scan for the least prominent position, the chair in the corner, the spot behind the column, anywhere that required no one to accommodate her presence. In conversations, she'd deflect attention the moment it landed on her. "Oh, that's nothing interesting. Tell me about your journey to Bath." She'd preemptively diminish her own accomplishments before anyone else could, offering self-deprecation as a shield against potential criticism. "My watercolors are quite amateurish, really. I just dabble." The code she'd internalized was clear. Taking up space was presumptuous, claiming achievements was arrogant, and the safest route was making herself so small that nobody could accuse her of overreaching. The vestige of her authentic self had nearly vanished beneath layers of strategic self-erasure. She'd also perfected the art of being useful rather than valued, offering herself as a bridge to more interesting people. At gatherings, she'd facilitate introductions. "You simply must meet my sister Elizabeth. She's far more entertaining than I am. Positioning herself as a connector rather than a destination. When gentlemen showed even passing interest, she'd redirect them. Oh, you'd find Catherine's insights on music far more fascinating than my thoughts on architecture. She'd become a human stepping stone, smooth and convenient for others to use in reaching more desirable shores. The silence around her own worth had grown so loud, she couldn't hear anything else. She'd convinced herself that utility was a form of value, that being needed was close enough to being wanted, that facilitating others' happiness was an acceptable substitute for pursuing her own. The enigma of self-sabotage is that it feels like self-protection. She'd learned to accept scraps of attention and call them feasts, to reframe neglect as independence, to convince herself that wanting more was greedy. When her family forgot her birthday, she'd told herself, "I'm not one for celebrations anyway." When invitations excluded her, she'd insisted, "I prefer quiet evenings at home." When a gentleman caller lost interest after 3 conversations, she'd decided, "I'm simply not suited for romance." Each disappointment got wrapped in justifications that made her complicit in her own erasure. The hidden agreement she'd made with herself was devastating. If she never expected anything, she could never be disappointed. If she never reached for what she wanted, she'd never have to face rejection. The conflict was that this protective strategy had locked her in a prison where safety meant suffocation. She'd even trained herself to be grateful for the absolute minimum, treating basic human decency as extraordinary generosity. When someone remembered her name, she'd feel disproportionate appreciation. When a conversation lasted more than 5 minutes, she'd replay it for days, mining it for significance. When anyone showed her the slightest consideration, she'd overflow with gratitude, as if kindness toward her was unexpected charity rather than standard courtesy. This was the forbidden mathematics of low self-worth. When you believe you deserve nothing, anything becomes everything. She'd set her standards so low that people could step over them without trying, and she'd thank them for not stepping on her completely. The revelation waiting to emerge was that this wasn't humility or graciousness. It was a betrayal of herself, so profound she'd mistaken it for virtue. The pattern had even infected her romantic life, teaching her to accept disappearances without protest. She'd met someone at a gallery opening, a gentleman who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts on art, who'd listened intently for hours. They'd met twice more, conversations flowing with rare ease, and she'd allowed herself to hope. Then he'd vanished. No explanation, just silence. 2 weeks later, a casual message arrived. "Apologies for my absence. I've been rather occupied." And instead of demanding the respect she deserved, instead of recognizing that his behavior was a code spelling out his disinterest, she'd responded with understanding. "Of course, no need to explain. How have you been?" She'd handed him permission to treat her as optional, as someone whose time and feelings required no consideration. Because, somewhere deep down, she still believed being chosen, even poorly, was better than not being chosen at all. The mysterious truth she'd need to confront was that this pattern would continue until she decided it was unacceptable, until she chose herself with the devotion she'd been waiting for someone else to demonstrate. She was 28 when the revelation arrived, not in a grand ballroom or during a dramatic confrontation, but on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a crowded marketplace. She'd been walking through the vendors, watching families laugh together, couples stroll arm in arm, friends share secrets over tea. Everyone seemed to inhabit their lives fully, claiming space without apology, existing with a confidence she'd never quite managed. And something inside her cracked, not gently, but violently, like ice breaking under too much weight. The thought came unbidden and brutal. I'm going to die like this, invisible. The sister nobody asks about, the daughter nobody celebrates, the woman nobody chooses. For the first time in her life, instead of accepting that future with resigned grace, she felt fury, pure, burning, righteous anger that she'd wasted so many years accommodating her own erasure, that she'd been so well behaved in her own disappearance, that the secret she'd kept even from herself was how desperately she wanted more. Anger, she discovered, was infinitely more useful than resignation. Resignation meant death, a slow, quiet, fading into irrelevance until you disappeared completely. But anger meant something still lived inside her that refused to surrender, something that looked at her circumstances and said, absolutely not. She felt rage toward her family for assigning her a diminished role, toward society for rewarding only certain types of women, toward every person who'd treated her as forgettable. But, mostly, devastatingly, she felt rage toward herself for accepting it all without protest, for making herself complicit in a conspiracy against her own worth. The conflict wasn't just external anymore, it was internal, a civil war between the part of her that had learned to survive by shrinking and the part that was finally demanding she expand. The vestige of who she might have been if she'd been raised differently haunted her. But perhaps more importantly, it showed her what might still be possible. Think of a plant that spent years growing in deep shade, stretching desperately toward whatever thin beam of light filters through. That plant has two choices. It can remain where it is, contorted and stunted, making the best of insufficient conditions. Or it can be moved into direct sunlight, where it will finally receive what it's always needed. But here's what nobody tells you about plants and people. You don't have to wait for someone else to move you. You possess agency, even when you've forgotten it exists. You can walk yourself out of the shadows, can choose environments where light is abundant rather than scarce, can stop competing for scraps of illumination in places designed to keep you dim. The enigma she'd been living was thinking she needed permission to pursue better conditions, when really she'd only ever needed courage. 3 truths emerged from that marketplace revelation, truths that restructured everything she'd believed about herself and her place in the world. The first truth was the most liberating. She wasn't the problem. For decades, she'd internalized every rejection as evidence of fundamental deficiency. She was too quiet, too serious, too intellectual, too something or not enough something else. But the reality was simpler and less personal. She'd been evaluated by criteria that had nothing to do with her actual value. It's like entering a horse race when your gift is poetry. You'll lose every time, not because you're inadequate, but because you're being judged by irrelevant standards. She was extraordinary. She'd just been performing in the wrong arena, for the wrong audience, by the wrong rules. The silence that had surrounded her wasn't commentary on her worth. It was commentary on others' inability to recognize it. The second truth was even more revolutionary. Somewhere in the world, people were searching for exactly what she offered. She'd spent years believing everyone wanted the same thing. Vivacious, charming women who lit up rooms and commanded attention effortlessly. But that was a lie society told to make certain women feel superior and others feel deficient. In reality, countless people were exhausted by performance, hungry for depth, craving authentic connection over entertaining conversation. They wanted substance, not sparkle. They valued thoughtfulness over wit, consistency over excitement, genuine presence over calculated charisma. She wasn't undesirable. She'd simply been marketing herself to people who desired something else entirely. The hidden truth was that her supposed flaws were actually specifications, filtering out those who'd never appreciate her while attracting those who'd been looking for her particular magic all along. The third truth was the most challenging and most essential. She needed to stop offering herself as a backup option. For years, she'd been available to anyone who showed even passing interest, grateful for whatever attention came her way, willing to accept being someone's second choice, third choice, afterthought. She'd trained people that her time, energy, and presence required no effort to access. They could take or leave her with equal ease, and she'd accommodate either decision with understanding. But value comes from scarcity, not abundance. When you're always available, always understanding, always willing to accept less than you deserve, you teach people that you're worth less than you deserve. The forbidden mathematics she'd been living by, something is better than nothing, needed to be replaced with new arithmetic. The right thing is better than anything. She tested this truth for the first time when her friend Cordelia sent a note asking for help with correspondence. Those letters to suitors that Cordelia was too scatterbrained to compose herself. Previously, she'd have rushed over immediately, flattered to be needed even in this utilitarian way. But this time she responded, "I'm occupied with my own pursuits at present. Perhaps next month if you're still in need." The disappearance of her usual compliance created ripples. Cordelia sent a follow-up note expressing surprise, a hint of offense bleeding through polite language. She didn't respond to that one at all. And something shifted. Cordelia managed her own correspondence, their friendship didn't dissolve, but the dynamic changed. Cordelia stopped treating her as a resource to be extracted and started engaging with her as an equal. The code had been rewritten through a single act of refusal. The mysterious part about choosing yourself is that it requires no dramatic declarations, no confrontations, no explanations. It's quieter than that. It's simply a decision to stop participating in your own diminishment, to stop showing up for situations that require you to be smaller than you are, to stop accepting treatment that violates your fundamental worth. It meant she stopped attending family gatherings where she was consistently overlooked, stopped maintaining friendships where reciprocity didn't exist, stopped entertaining romantic interests from men who treated her as optional. Each boundary she established felt terrifying because she'd spent a lifetime believing that accommodation was how you earned love. But the revelation that finally took root was this: love that requires you to abandon yourself isn't love at all. It's colonization. And she was done letting others occupy the territory of her soul while she stood displaced at the borders of her own life, waiting for permission to come home. 6 months after her awakening, she attended Lady Pemberton's birthday celebration with a fundamentally different energy. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Same modest gown, same simple hairstyle, same quiet presence. But everything internal had shifted, a mysterious transformation that wasn't visible to the eye, yet somehow radiated from her like heat from a flame. She wasn't scanning the room for validation anymore, wasn't positioning herself strategically to catch anyone's attention, wasn't performing the exhausting theater of trying to be noticed. She was simply present, genuinely engaged in conversation with her friend about a novel she'd been reading, animated and laughing freely, completely absorbed in the moment. And then something unprecedented happened. A gentleman crossed the entire ballroom, weaving through clusters of people, ignoring more obviously beautiful women, walking with clear purpose to reach her. "Forgive the interruption," he said, "but I couldn't help overhearing your discussion of that book, and I absolutely must speak with someone who's read it." They talked for 2 hours straight, conversation flowing like water, finding its natural course. He didn't glance around the room seeking better options, didn't check his pocket watch, didn't excuse himself to pay respects to more important guests. His attention remained fixed on her, genuinely curious about her thoughts, building on her observations, treating her insights as valuable rather than merely tolerable. When her sister Elizabeth drifted past and attempted to join their conversation, he politely acknowledged her but didn't shift his focus. He'd come to speak with her, not to collect an introduction to her more celebrated sister. The revelation crashed through her with the force of a summer storm. This was what it felt like to be chosen deliberately, to be someone's first choice rather than their consolation prize. And for the first time in her life, she didn't find it shocking or unbelievable. She found it appropriate. Because she'd finally started believing she had something worth choosing. Think of how magnets work. They don't attract everything in their vicinity. A magnet placed beside wood does nothing. Glass, nothing. Plastic, nothing. But bring iron near that magnet, and the attraction is instantaneous, powerful, inevitable. You don't need to be magnetic to everything. You only need to be magnetic to your specific material. She'd spent years trying to attract wood, becoming devastated when it didn't respond, thinking the problem was her magnetic field. But wood was never going to respond because wood isn't ferromagnetic. The secret she'd finally understood was that she needed to stop attempting to attract the wrong materials and simply exist as the magnet she naturally was. The right metal would find her, not through manipulation or performance, but through authentic resonance. When you stop trying to be everything to everyone, you become exactly what you are to the ones who matter. 5 principles emerged from this transformation, codes she'd cracked about genuine attraction that completely contradicted everything society had taught her. First principle: authentic energy attracts more powerfully than manufactured performance. When she stopped trying to be charming and simply allowed herself to be engaged, people responded to her realness rather than her rehearsed presentation. There's something magnetic about someone who's fully present in their own experience, rather than monitoring how they're being perceived. Second principle: people who seek you out consciously have more staying power than those who stumble onto you accidentally. The gentleman who crossed the ballroom had made a choice. He'd actively pursued conversation with her. That intention created a completely different foundation than the casual attention of someone who was merely being polite or passing time. Third principle, and perhaps the most crucial: you attract at the level of your self-perception. When she believed she was a backup option, she attracted people who treated her as exactly that. Convenient when nothing better was available, disposable when something shinier appeared. But when her internal narrative shifted to, "I am valuable, interesting, and worthy of deliberate choice," suddenly she started encountering people who reflected that belief back to her. It's not mystical, it's mathematical. Your self-concept broadcasts on a frequency that only certain people can detect, and they respond accordingly. The conflict is that most of us broadcast on frequencies that advertise our wounds rather than our worth, and we're perpetually confused why we keep attracting people who exploit rather than cherish us. Fourth principle: specificity attracts better than generality. When she stopped trying to be a pleasant young lady and allowed herself to be the woman who reads philosophy and collects unusual botanical specimens and has strong opinions about architecture, she became memorable rather than forgettable. Generic is invisible. Everyone blurs together into an indistinct mass of nice enough people. But specific creates recognition, gives people something to grasp onto, generates conversation that goes deeper than surface pleasantries. She'd spent years sanding down her edges to avoid seeming difficult or strange, but those edges were precisely what made her interesting. The vestige of uniqueness she'd been suppressing was actually her greatest asset in attracting genuine connection. Fifth principle, perceived scarcity increases perceived value. This wasn't about playing games or manipulating interest. It was about recognizing a fundamental truth about human psychology. When she stopped being constantly available, stopped dropping everything to accommodate others' schedules, stopped treating her own time and energy as infinitely renewable resources, people started approaching her differently. They scheduled time with her in advance rather than expecting immediate access. They made effort to maintain connection rather than assuming she'd always be there. The silence she'd once filled with over-availability now created space for others to step forward, to demonstrate their interest through action rather than vague words. She wasn't playing hard to get. She'd simply stopped being easy to take for granted. The mysterious alchemy of attraction, she discovered, wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about becoming more fully herself and trusting that the right people would recognize what they found. She didn't need to be prettier, wittier, more accomplished, or more like her sisters. She needed to inhabit her own existence with conviction, to stop apologizing for her particularities, to treat herself with the reverence she'd been waiting for others to demonstrate first. The hidden truth was that she'd always been attractive to the right people. She'd just been too busy trying to attract the wrong ones to notice who was actually looking. And now, standing in her own magnetic field without apology, she was finally ready to recognize when iron approached the magnet, and to welcome it without the old desperate gratitude, but with calm assurance that this was simply how things worked when you stopped fighting your own nature. The most terrifying question she'd ever asked herself came late one evening in her private chambers, candle flickering as she stared at her reflection and whispered, "Who am I when I remove everyone else from the equation?" Not the dutiful daughter, not the overlooked sister, not the helpful friend who solved everyone's problems, not the woman hoping to be chosen by a gentleman who'd finally see her value. Strip away every role, every relationship, every external definition. What remained? The silence that followed was deafening because the answer was almost nothing. She'd constructed her entire identity around other people, defining herself exclusively through her position in various social configurations. Without those reference points, she was a blank page, and the enigma was whether that emptiness was tragedy or opportunity. Had she lost herself, or had she simply never built a self to begin with? The revelation took a full year to unfold. 12 months of uncomfortable excavation, digging through layers of expectations and performances to find whatever authentic core might exist underneath. It wasn't an intellectual exercise she could solve through contemplation alone. It required experimentation, testing different versions of herself in environments where nobody knew her history. She started taking solo walks through parts of the city where she'd never be recognized, attending lectures on subjects nobody in her family cared about, visiting galleries during hours when she'd encounter strangers rather than acquaintances. In these anonymous spaces, she could be anyone, or more importantly, she could discover who she actually was when freed from the conspiracy of preset roles. The vestige of her true self began emerging not through thinking, but through doing, through noticing what genuinely captured her attention when she wasn't performing for anyone's approval. Think of Michelangelo's approach to sculpture. He believed the statue already existed inside the marble, complete and perfect, waiting to be revealed. His job wasn't to create something from nothing, but to remove everything that wasn't the statue, chipping away excess until truth emerged. Reconstructing your identity works the same way. You're not adding layers of new personality traits or adopting characteristics that seem desirable. You're removing the accumulated debris of others' expectations, the masks you wore to survive various social situations, the false selves you constructed to gain acceptance. The hidden reality is that you've always been complete underneath all that protective camouflage. You just couldn't see yourself clearly through all the distortion. She developed 3 practical exercises that helped her distinguish between what was genuinely hers and what she'd borrowed to fit in. First exercise. She listed 10 things she loved that nobody in her family or social circle shared. This was harder than it should have been. She'd spent so long gravitating toward acceptable interests that she'd forgotten what naturally drew her attention. But slowly, the list emerged. She loved the smell of libraries, the architecture of medieval churches, collecting pressed flowers, the sound of rain against windows, walking at dawn when streets were empty, reading philosophical texts that required concentration, sketching botanical specimens with scientific precision, the taste of black coffee without sugar, wearing deep green even though pastels were fashionable, and the company of older scholars who discussed ideas rather than gossip. These preferences revealed the code of her authentic self, the pattern that existed independent of social approval. Second exercise, she practiced introducing herself to strangers without mentioning a single relationship. Not sister of Elizabeth, not daughter of the Ashworth family, not friend of Lady Catherine. Just, I'm Margaret. I study botany and architecture, and I'm fascinated by how medieval builders incorporated natural patterns into structural design. The first few times she tried this, panic nearly choked her. Without relational context, who was she to these people? But gradually, she discovered that introducing herself through her genuine interests created far more engaging conversations than name-dropping ever had. People responded to her specificity, asked questions about her studies, shared their own fascinations. She'd spent years thinking her family connections were her value, when actually they'd been obscuring her value, reducing her to a peripheral character in someone else's story rather than the protagonist of her own. Third exercise. She deliberately sought social situations where nobody knew her history, where she could present herself fresh without the weight of accumulated perceptions. She joined a botanical society in the next county, attended lectures at universities where no one recognized her family name, volunteered at a charitable foundation where her contributions mattered more than her pedigree. In these environments, the disappearance of her usual identity was liberating rather than frightening. Nobody compared her to her sisters because they'd never met her sisters. Nobody had preset expectations about how she should behave because they had no previous data. She could be fully herself, awkward when she felt awkward, enthusiastic when something excited her, quiet when she had nothing to say, without worrying about violating some established character she was supposed to maintain. The mysterious part of this reconstruction was discovering that she actually liked the person emerging from beneath all those accumulated roles. She'd spent so long believing she needed to become someone else, someone more like Elizabeth's charm or Catherine's grace, that she'd never considered whether her authentic self might actually be enough. More than enough, even. Preferable. The woman who loved intellectual complexity, who could spend hours absorbed in detailed work, who preferred depth to breadth in both knowledge and relationships, who felt most alive in quiet contemplation rather than social performance. This woman was interesting, valuable, worthy of admiration. The conflict had never been between who she was and who she should be. It had been between her authentic self and the performance she'd mistaken for identity. She started making choices based on this reconstructed sense of self, and everything shifted. She stopped attending balls she found tedious, stopped pretending to enjoy activities that bored her, stopped maintaining friendships that required her to be someone she wasn't. Some relationships ended naturally, revealing they'd only existed because she'd been willing to contort herself to maintain them. But other connections deepened, particularly with people who'd always sensed there was more to her than the quiet, agreeable persona she'd been performing. They'd been waiting for her to drop the mask, and when she finally did, they met her authentic self with enthusiasm rather than rejection. The secret she'd been protecting, that she was somehow deficient, turned out to be backwards. The real her was infinitely more interesting than the sanitized version she'd been presenting, and the people worth knowing could see that immediately once she stopped hiding it. So here's the question that matters. What are you going to do with this knowledge? Because understanding the pattern is worthless if you continue living inside it. You now know that invisibility wasn't something inherent to you. It was systematically constructed through years of comparisons, dismissals, and a conspiracy of low expectations that you eventually internalized. You know that your family, your social circle, maybe even you yourself have been maintaining a system where you play supporting character while others claim the spotlight. The secret is out. You've been complicit in your own erasure, accepting treatment that violates your fundamental worth because you believed that's all you deserved. But here's the liberating truth. The moment you decide this pattern is unacceptable, it begins to crumble. Not slowly, not eventually, but immediately. I want you to think about something right now, and I want you to be brutally honest. Who would you be if you stopped accommodating your own invisibility? If you stopped making yourself small to make others comfortable? If you stopped accepting scraps of attention and calling it connection? If you refused to be anyone's backup option, anyone's convenient resource, anyone's forgettable footnote? The woman who emerges when you strip away all those protective diminishments. That's who you actually are. That's who's been waiting underneath all the performance and accommodation. The enigma you've been too afraid to solve because solving it means you'll have no more excuses for staying hidden. It means you'll have to claim space, demand reciprocity, walk away from situations that require you to betray yourself. It means becoming visible, and visibility is terrifying when you've spent your entire life in shadows. But let me tell you what happens when you finally step into the light. The right people notice immediately. Not everyone. You don't need everyone. You need the ones who've been searching for exactly what you offer, who recognize depth when they encounter it, who cross entire ballrooms because they heard you talking about something that matters and they can't let the opportunity pass. These people exist. They're out there right now, probably feeling just as invisible as you've felt, wondering if anyone will ever see them past the surface performance society demands. When you stop hiding, you become visible to them, and that mutual recognition creates connections that don't require you to diminish yourself to maintain. The hidden truth is that authentic attraction doesn't happen despite your particularities. It happens because of them. So I'm going to challenge you. Do one thing this week that your invisible self would never do. Take up space you usually avoid. Express an opinion you typically suppress. Say no to something you'd normally accept out of obligation. Attend an event alone where nobody knows your history. Introduce yourself without mentioning a single relationship, just your name and what genuinely fascinates you. Notice what happens. Notice who responds. Notice how it feels to exist without apologizing for your existence. And then do it again. And again, until the performance of invisibility feels more exhausting than the risk of being seen. Until playing small becomes more uncomfortable than claiming your actual size. This isn't about overnight transformation. It's about incremental rebellion against every pattern that taught you to disappear. Here's what I need you to understand. Your life is happening right now. Not someday when you're prettier, more confident, more like your sister or your friend or whoever you've been using as the standard you'll never meet. Right now, in this body, with this personality, with these specific interests that make you weird and wonderful and absolutely irreplaceable. Every day you spend accommodating your own invisibility is a day you're choosing the comfortable prison over the uncomfortable freedom. And I get it. The prison is familiar. You know its dimensions. You've learned to survive there. But survival isn't living, and you weren't put on this earth to merely survive. You were put here to be fully, unapologetically, magnificently yourself, and someone out there is waiting for exactly that person to finally show up. The vestige of who you could have been if you'd been raised differently haunts you, I know. But what if who you could still become is even better? What if all those years of invisibility taught you empathy, depth, resilience, the ability to see others clearly because you know what it's like to be overlooked? What if your greatest weakness is actually your greatest strength, just waiting for the right context to be recognized as valuable? The conflict isn't between who you are and who you should be. It's between accepting the story that was written for you and writing your own. And you're the only one holding the pen. If this resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in these patterns, if you're ready to stop being the forgotten sister and start being the woman people cross rooms to reach, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Because we're going deeper into this. We're talking about how to set boundaries with family members who benefit from your invisibility, how to recognize genuine interest versus polite tolerance, how to build a life that reflects your actual values instead of everyone else's expectations. This is just the beginning of your revelation, the first crack in the foundation of lies you've been building your life on. And once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. So stay with me. Let's dismantle this conspiracy together and build something real in its place. Your authentic life is waiting. Are you finally ready to claim it?